What would it take to move just a quarter of the beverage market away from single-use to reusable packaging? And what if that shift could eliminate billions of plastic bottles, create thousands of local jobs, and build a more resilient circular economy? In this episode of the Reloop Brief, we're joined by Sam Pearce, the campaigns director at the Story of Stuff project. We're going to hear about their new animated film that explores the future of reuse, the research behind it, and why reusable packaging systems are gaining momentum around the world. From California to Latin America and Europe, we're going to explore different policies, infrastructure and innovation needed to make reuse work at scale, and what the role of a deposit return system could play in accelerating that transition. But first, Sam explains how the Story of Stuff project came about.
The Story of Stuff project is an environmental advocacy organisation based in the US, but with a community globally. I think it's fair to say it sort of came around as a sort of happy accident, really, which was that it really sprang out of one of the early cause-related viral videos on YouTube in 2008, a sort of self-titled video, The Story of Stuff. I mean, it was really a summary of research that had been done by Annie Leonard, the former chief executive and head of Greenpeace, who had gone around the world and pulled all this research together, really about problems with the way that we sort of utilize resources, the waste it creates, and the way that people are harmed along the way, and the way that seemingly so many of the sort of imperatives and incentives around that may be built in a way that could be improved. So since then, we've really focused on two things. One is working on the storytelling dimension, making accessible content, movies, videos, that tell stories about aspects of this global waste system, and really inviting people to become change makers in shifting some of those dynamics at play.
There's a really good chance, because you said the initial video was a viral sensation. People may know about you, but maybe not know everything about you. They've maybe seen that video, but don't know some of the other work that you've been doing. But let's talk a little bit about the new animation then that you've created. What led you to do that?
Over the last few years, we've really looked at the beverage industry in particular, both because it seems to be at the heart of a lot of the waste that we see characterized in places across the world, but also where there's so much potential, I think, to do things a different way. And so we worked a bit with a consulting group last year, Eunomia, on really a pretty extensive report, sort of feasibility and the impact of switching from sort of single-use packaging in the beverage industry to reusable systems, and seeing what would that actually look like, how would it work, and what might the benefits be. Overall, I think the picture was really bright, and I think there's a really strong case to be made for that. And this video was really was designed to be a sort of companion piece to that report and that piece of advocacy work. We are in the second year of really seeing what sort of advocacy levers we can push on in a number of US states to see if we can drive a set of policies that catalyze and drive forward the shift to reusable systems in the beverage industry. And the video was designed to be a sort of companion piece that was making it feel accessible and showing it from a bit of the customer experience, but also like lifting a little bit of a behind the scenes on, if you're trying to make this kind of scaled, interoperable reuse system, what might that actually look like, and who's involved in making that all come together?
I think the numbers in the report were really quite eye-watering in the best possible way. It's a simple change. It wasn't everybody swapping to reusable beverage containers. It was a percentage that would result in huge change. That's easy to see on paper, but there is this conversation happening, not just in America, but in lots of places around the world, about reuse, and not just within beverage containers. Why do you think that is becoming a conversation piece just now?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think there's a couple different elements to it. I think one part of it is that there continue to be a number of issues with recycling at large, but also as I think we look at examples, as you say, Barry, from around the world, there are lots of places that are doing this really well. I think reusable systems, some are maybe older systems. Some are more newer and emergent systems. We've seen, for example, parts of Latin America in particular, Chile, Colombia, Brazil. You have companies like Coca-Cola who are not just running and operating legacy reusable systems, but actively sort of investing in and driving change towards, can you come up with a single bottle that gets kind of reused, is used for different beverage types, and it really has a meaningful impact in terms of reducing waste. And we were also really inspired to see the kind of changes afoot in the EU, the big landmark piece of legislation there, both in terms of the way that that might catalyze the way that the beverage industry is doing things, but the way that the retailers are also offering more options perhaps to those stocking in reusable formats. We've found some really heroic examples of both microbrewers and wineries on the US West Coast here who are almost going it alone, who are really so invested in this idea of like, we really want to be part of this change. We want to reduce the waste and reduce all the energy going into all this single-use packaging. They're really giving it a shot. And so there are lots of different kind of examples dotted around the world. And I think part of what we wanted to do is say, okay, this is great. What might this look like to sort of bring some of this together into a coherent model? Ideally one where you have some level of cooperation inside the beverage industry. So for example, could you have some parts of the system like the washing hubs and all of that could be used by either different manufacturers or even different bottle designs, that kind of thing. So I think there are some really strong arguments to shift towards reusables. And, I think the way that this works out in different parts of the world may look a little bit different. But altogether, I think having a kind of a roadmap guiding the direction is, at least for us, felt like an important first step to getting to steps 1 and 2.
One of the things that's highlighted in the film is the global reuse symbol. Tell us a wee bit more about that if you can.
For context, I think it's interesting that right now in the US and probably to some extent globally, there is still a sort of raging debate about recycling, what constitutes as recycling, and how do you create those shared understandings about the standards. And I think that probably has been one of the things that's given pause to thought for, okay, if we're embarking on this new system of reusables, how do we ensure that we have a shared understanding, that the standards around it are really high? Reusing reusable packaging, it makes a lot of sense, but of course you really want to make sure that the resources stay in circulation as long as possible. And to those ends, I think there's been a really concerted effort by a group called PR3 with lots of people involved in the process of establishing this set of standards around reusable packaging, foodware, things like that, from this manufacturing side, from how well something holds up over time, and all those kind of things. And it's continuing to kind of push towards the set of standards, which I think are a really important baseline. It's also come up with this new symbol, which is designed to be unique, to stand out and be different from the recycling symbol. And of course, these things take time to seep into a shared understanding. But even over the last month or so, I think since it's released, there are a number of both companies and we as storytellers were hoping to add this into the mix really and show that this is going to be, I think, an important part of how we identify reusable packaging and also, sort of make people feel good about when they're taking part and participating in reusable systems. I think people are starting to understand that when they get involved in participating in these reuse systems, they know that they're participating in something that is ultimately is beneficial and is good. So yeah, we were excited to include that in the video.
The animation's fantastic, by the way. I really do like that. Going back on it, the animation follows the research that was done in that paper that was released last year. I don't know if you want to pull out any highlights from that or any findings that most stood out that encourage you to continue this conversation. We need to keep telling people about it. We need to continue the story.
The first thing was really, could we take 25% of the beverage market in a given place? In this case, it was looking at California. It This is just one state, but it is a pretty large one. That's of 38 million people or so. And how quickly can we do this, essentially? How quickly could we shift part of the market to reusables? And this was sort of the headline piece of the report, was really looking at the idea that we could shift about 25% of the beverage market to refillables in a decade. That was helpful for us in terms of anchoring the advocacy work that we wanted to do and seeing what was feasible. Beyond that, I think, assuming that consumption patterns were the same, the impact would be sort of 3 billion fewer plastic bottles sold annually. Again, this would just be in the state of California. Significant savings in terms of cans and bottles ending up in the environment. I think around 32 million. And then, just so many other savings, water savings, of course, waste management savings associated with less litter cleanup. I think part of the thing that was most impressive to me perhaps was the increase in the number of jobs. So it is not the easiest thing, switching from a single-use system to a reusable system. And part of that is because through the process of shifting to single-use, the operations have got so much more centralized. And so shifting that requires a much more regional or local approach, I think. So to really make everything make sense, and this is something that we tried to sort of show a little bit in the animation, what you want is a more kind of local economy. And that is really a good thing, because it means that you're shifting jobs back to different regions. It is essentially supporting and providing jobs and industry for the end users. You're creating a sort of micro sort of circular economies. So we're looking at, I think, 11,000 jobs under this proposal in California. And there is some cost associated with it, but if it's done in a way that is sort of streamlined, the report showed that it could be done at, I think, around 1% or less of the annual revenue of the beverage industry as a whole. And there are so many sort of benefits that I think there's a really strong sort of case to be made.
For a lot of people, it's a case that would be really easy to make and understand. But how do you see that reuse and deposit return situation working together in the future?
It's interesting, because I think one of the things that's come into the conversation in the US recently is there's just been a lot less predictability when it comes to how the market operates. We've seen, for example, the global pandemic some years ago affecting supply chains. We've had tariffs more recently that have done the same thing. And in some ways, we've seen that operators using reusable systems have really appreciated having those systems, because it's kind of insulated them against the challenges around sudden sort of market volatility. So that's been an interesting one to watch. So, for example, when we looked at California, part of the motivation was we already have a bottle bill. There's no doubt that it could be improved, and the report looked at elements of that, making sure that there are already improvements underway in the convenience, I think, for consumers to take back their empty bottles and cans. But I think the main thing is a lot of this, particularly when you have a deposit system already in place, a lot of the infrastructure is already built out in terms of the consumer understanding, some of the consumer behavior. And then it's really mainly a case of, okay, so different systems work differently, but you can either have the companies who either own or manage the bottles, who are just going to collect and pick up directly from stores, retailers, that kind of thing. That could be where the bottles and cans are dropped off. One of the things that the report looked at is the sort of different levels of sorting centers. So making sure that bottles end up being centralized and scaled in some of the larger processors in the state. But really the main missing ingredient, I think, right now, beyond working on the new bottle designs and that kind of thing, is actually just the washing hubs. The number of wash hubs you need probably depends on what kind of market share you're looking at, and whether you can wash different kinds of bottles in these systems. And also, ideally, the transport distances you want to keep relatively low. There's not a huge amount of carbon emissions involved in the transportation side. So There's a little bit of a trade-off there in terms of, more washing hubs means less transportation distance. So, you have to figure that out a little bit. But it's really that getting those washing hubs in place and then figuring out some of the different routing systems and obviously separating the reusable bottles from ending up in the same place as single-use systems. There is always going to be a period of adaptation processing, but it does feel pretty manageable.
Sam Pearce from the Story of Stuff project. If you'd like to learn more about the research and the animation discussed in this episode, you'll find links in the show notes. And as always, please subscribe, leave a review, share the podcast with colleagues or friends, and find out more at reloopplatform.org. I'll leave the final word to Sam.
Congrats to everyone working on this on all the different sides, because I think what I'm starting to see is an ecosystem globally of folks that are all taking on different parts of this, trying to implement new business models, trying to figure out the legislation and regulatory systems. Some people are looking at the standards, some businesses are going it alone, all of that, and we're starting to see we're much better able to share our understanding about the way that these systems can work and borrow and share each other's great ideas. So kudos to everyone working on this, and I'm sure we're going to see some really great progress on this in the coming years.